What is failing?
I think that the numbers are a bit contestable. You know, some reports say 30, some say 31, some say 35. Whichever the case is about 30, 35.
But still a high number, no doubt.
Now, we need to segment and break down those reports. You know, you have attempted attacks, you have suspicious vehicles, you have, in classification, shot at, then complete hijack. So it's about 5 classifications. Everything is grouped into a maritime incident. Okay, but the numbers are high. I'm not making an excuse for the numbers, but I think some of us who assess would there's a sense in the general area that these issues has tampered down a bit. Okay, now there are two reasons for that. Number one is that there's certain reported attempts by government to underreport the incidents, so you don't hear so much of those incidents happening. Now, the other major consideration would be that the political climate in the Niger Delta seems to have been a bit more amenable to oil production, so I think that incidents has come down a bit significantly. We do worry that as we get closer to the elections, you may begin to see an uptick in some of these incidents, which is also fueling and driving some of the things we've seen. I think from July this year, we've seen a surge a bit. 1, 2, 3 incidents reported here and there.
Right.
So
When you said we could see an uptick related to elections,
yes.
Are you more or less saying that there is a direct link between political campaigning and the illegal wealth generated by some of these piracy activities?
No, that's not what we're saying. You know, for crime to thrive, there must be an enabling environment, or you need to have some certain conditions that would seem to support those activities. In analysis, when you look at piracy, they must have land. They must have an operational base to operate from. Okay, and most times when we talk about addressing piracy, you talk about the land side. How do you deny them that access to land and an environment to operate from? Now, getting closer to an election, particularly in this part of the world, everything seems to be suspended a bit. You know, then the police, the army, everybody's all, let's calm down, let's make the environment more peaceful, don't be too hostile. That's one side. On the other side, some of these people need they need money to also support and show allegiances to some warlords, and some warlords also need to make the boys happy. You know, so then you have arms flying around. There's a proliferation of arms that causes these people to go to sea. Then you also talk about the impoverishment of those riverine communities. You know, I think sometime this year, it was reported that the presidential aid, additional, did say that unemployment is the reason for the increase in piracy in in the Niger Delta area. So as we get closer to the election, yes, some conditions will begin to change on ground, and then you may begin to see an uptick in violence.
So disparities in classification and the underreporting that you highlighted earlier do suggest poor information management, especially when you consider the fact that it's been 3 days on since the 12 kidnapped are still unaccounted for. And when the news first filtered into the media, the Nigerian Navy and the Marines were reported to have said they did not have information, as at the time the news was already out in the media. So who's dropping the communication ball?
I think that should be expected. It depends on who you've spoken to. And if the person you've spoken to doesn't have the release to speak, the authority to speak, then, I mean, remember that we've said from the get-go that there appears to be, it's not an allegation, government is trying to manage information. Now, remember, every state manages information to some extent, okay? So it's not new to Nigeria, okay? So I think there's a bit of information management going on there, okay? And it depends on who you spoke to. Did you speak to the first PRO? Did you speak to the PRO of the Navy? You know, who was the person who said they didn't know? Because quite frankly, everybody knew what was happening.
Yeah. Ultimately, what we want to hear is that the situation is being addressed and hopefully gets under control. Do you get the sense that we're making the right steps in that direction?
To be fair to the government and this administration, let's be fair to them. If you look at the 2018 budget, and if we say budget is a policy statement which shows government's intent, there's been a number of CAPEX proposals for the Navy. They're trying to acquire a number of naval platforms. We've seen steadily since 2015 an increased investment in naval assets. Now, the challenge we have is not just limited to Nigeria. But Nigeria, being the biggest state in West Africa, is left to patrol the Gulf of Guinea. You know, and when it comes to patrolling the naval waters, those waters off the coast of Benin, Togo, Ghana, Nigeria's navy is somewhat overstretched. Okay, and this again is a bit of a challenge. Some other West African states need to also play their own fair part in addressing and curbing the issues of piracy.
So while we'll talk about excuses earlier from the presidency that unemployment could be linked to rise in kidnappings and misdemeanors, and also what you said about capex and allocations for empowering the Nigerian Navy as a means to curbing all of these incidences. Let's take a step back to 2017. The Nigerian Senate passed a law on kidnapping, proposing the death sentence and the death sentence for the abductor himself or herself, and 30 years for collaborators. So should we worry about enforcement? That was a year ago. And we are still here talking about rising numbers and fresh cases.
Okay, so thank God we're on CNBC now. Look at the budget performance for 2017. I'm a security person. Okay, but let's talk economics a bit. 52%. We generated what? About 2.something trillion. There are a number of things. We are having to borrow to fund consumption, which is also bad. So the country is in a bit of a precarious situation. It's not
fiscal challenge.
There's a fiscal challenge already.
Everything.
It's impacting everything. Now, if you look at the police, for instance, the police budget for 2018 is about 390-something billion or 340-something billion, about 300-something billion now. 90% of that expense goes into recurrent expenses, which is your salaries. The capex part is about 10%. They won't get 4%. You see, so there are fiscal challenges already. That said, we saw that at least sometime early this year, they took out $1 billion to purchase some aircraft from America. So we've seen a steady increase in investment in naval assets. Those investments are beginning to pay off. Now, Nigeria is also trying to enforce completely this automatic identification system for vessels coming in and out of Nigeria's waters and some of those waters around the Gulf of Guinea. There are issues and there are challenges also. So I think that the other West African states must play their part. I saw your initial report when it says that Somalia is a bit more safer. Vessels going into Somalia, they know what the area is like. So there's a level of investment in security, both in insurance and physical security on the vessels to ensure that as they travel, they have some level of provision. So most of the vessels going into that Somalia axis are armed and hardened, as we say. So it's different.
But very quickly, if you can just respond to this, do you think there's a risk at all, a real risk that we may begin to talk about the Gulf of Guinea the same way we've been speaking about Somalia in the past?
So it's where we pay attention and what we pay attention to.
Because you've already stated that there are fiscal challenges and that could impact the ability of the authorities to provide security.
So if you're coming into, now the onus shifts back to the vessel owners and the shipping companies. If you're coming into the Gulf of Guinea, and you know already that you're coming to a hostile area, an area that is prone to some level of threats, you need to at least have some mitigation measures on board.
So for you, funding is a critical aspect of all of this?
Funding both sides. The shipping companies don't want to increase their cost more than it is already. Insurance is high coming to the Gulf of Guinea. You know, the cost of security on board is also high. So a lot of shipping companies also don't want these incidents reported because they've not made sufficient security arrangements coming into the Gulf of Guinea. So